So in Motherwell's interpretation of black and white, he reads white as meaning life, existence, and éclat, which is brilliance, whereas black signifies death, anxiety, and non-being. Do you agree with him that this is the symbolic understanding of black and white at a universal level, or is it specific to Western culture?
I would say that it is specific to the global system of racism, white supremacy. For example, I can read to you the Christian European literature, art, and language all emphasize the virtue of light and white and equated black with night, dirt, and evil. Now I'm reading from a textbook on pigmentation, its genesis and biologic control, but indeed that is the perception in the context of the system of racism, white supremacy, and I say context is everything, and generally speaking, we do not think about a context of a local, national, global system of racism, white supremacy, but I maintain that that is the power context in which this pattern of perception has existed and continues to exist.
So when we look at, let's say, black and white abstraction in, prominent institution in the U.S., you'd say that we have to kind of think about it, the symbolism of it, in relation to that broader context in which it's presented?
Well, I would say that that's the only, things that are taken out of context end up being nonsensical. Mm-hmm. But since there is an overall denial of racism, white supremacy, people who classify themselves as white do not have to think about this because they are the power structure, so to speak. And people who are not white may see things quite differently, but my definition of racism, white supremacy is that it is a power, briefly speaking, it's a power construct for white genetic survival on planet Earth, because on planet Earth the overwhelming majority of people are black, brown, red, and yellow, and it's only a very tiny minority of people who classify themselves as white. And because this tiny minority is genetic recessive in terms of skin coloration, the system of racism has evolved consciously and subconsciously for the purpose of white genetic survival. So the system structure that is practiced in economics, education, entertainment, labor law, politics, religion, sex, and war is really a survival construct for the white minority. So, of course, they don't talk about it in those terms. And I would say that, perhaps the majority of people who classify themselves as white don't ever think about this at a conscious level. And that's why 36 years ago in my first paper, The Cress Theory, I challenged white behavioral scientists to help white people become comfortable with their minority status on the planet and their genetic recessive status. Mm-hmm. You see, but that has not happened, and I say the challenge is for white behavioral scientists because within the context, the power construct of white supremacy, people who classify themselves as white, they may listen to black people sing or play football or basketball, but they don't have to listen to black people who are giving analyses of white behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also particularly in the art world, around abstract art, people never really think about it in terms of a context of racism, and a lot of people kind of cherish the work as a way to kind of escape kind of the immediate sort of social world around them. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering in regards to Motherwell's Elegies, oftentimes white critics, see this connection between black and death that Motherwell, puts out for them. and many, interestingly, particularly women, recognize the connection of those forms with kind of phallic symbols, the penis and testicles. But I've never, apart from in your book, the ISIS Papers, I've never come across a critic who kind of reads that as a combined symbolic form of a black penis, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if maybe you could kind of elaborate that connection. Well, I think you explained why it is that white critics aren't sort of don't want to see it. Maybe it's because they're in some kind of denial. But I was wondering if you could explain that connection between blackness, sexuality, and death in the white imagination.
Well, again, if you accept my thesis that racism is structured out of the fear of white genetic annihilation on planet Earth, and so therefore the greatest threat to white genetic survival is the genital apparatus of black men. Mm-hmm. And so it's like as a part of the history in this country when black men were lynched on a weekly basis. They were lynched and castrated without people thinking, well, why are white men attacking black men's genitalia? See, that question never came up. Mm-hmm. But I say that if consciously and or subconsciously there is the fear of genetic annihilation, which is why there was always a coupling of the black man looked at a white female, or the black man wanted to have sex with a white female. That became the justification for the lynching of the black male and also for attacking his genitalia. Mm-hmm. So this is where, but this is not consciously thought about. You know, no one in the white world, so to speak, is thinking at this level, and it would be disruptive. Like I had a white person say to me, when I listened to your lecture, my brain became popcorn. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Because everything is structured, everything that people who classify, see, but when you classify yourself as white, that carries a lot of baggage with it. It carries the reality of white minority status. It carries with it genetic recessive status. But this is very often at the subconscious level. It's not something that people are constantly thinking about. But then when the artist goes forward and produces a painting, he or she may not be consciously aware of why certain things come to their mind. But then Motherwell paints a series of paintings and gives them a title that is related to death. Mm-hmm. But he's not seeing it in terms of what is in the white subconscious. Mm-hmm. He's dealing with it at a conscious level, but that is not dealing with the deeper subconscious meaning mm-hmm. of these symbols to the white collective. And you know, the overwhelming majority of white people who look at his work are not dealing with it at the subconscious level. It's, you know, the writer who wrote The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison. Do you see where black people are basically invisible? I just came from an art fair that was at a white school, and I was just noticing the way that you know, a large group of white people and a black person is moving amongst them, and it's as though the black person is not even there. Mm-hmm. Do you see where we can be blind to black people at a certain level, but at another level, we have an entire system that is a defensive structure to prevent black people, black males in particular, preventing them from causing white genetic annihilation.
So yeah, I think also this, what you bring up about art as being a practice that whites use in order to kind of or particularly with this kind of abstract expressionist stuff, to try to get at some of these unconscious feelings or emotions in relationship to blackness. I think that comes across in my research, as you find a lot of these artists such as Motherwell and Pollock and a man named Gottlieb using particularly black paint in order to make these expressions in what they called, sort of automatic drawing, which I think is, you could maybe explain it better to me, that similar to free association kind of in psychoanalysis, where they kind of draw freely and then interpret what's made. And so in the kind of drawings that they ended up making, the way that they used black paint was kind of pouring it or throwing it, letting it kind of flow very freely, or splash or splatter. And they, and critics as well, kind of interpret it as gestures of sort of natural rhythm and sexuality and freedom on the one hand, but then also read it as kind of a rejection of a kind of a Western idea of beauty, and associate it with violence and sort of bodily excretions, debasement, kind of this kind of degrading.
But all of that goes together.
Uh-huh.
In other words, the deep and fundamental fear for anyone who classifies himself as white is white genetic annihilation. Like I ask audiences of white people, do you want your children to be colored? Do you want your grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-great-great-grandchildren to be colored? I'm polite, they're polite. Their answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? But they're saying no on a planet in which the overwhelming majority of people are black, brown, red, and yellow, and black people have the greatest genetic potential to cause white genetic annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? So
right.
Even though they may say, no, I do not want my children to be colored,
mm-hmm.
or my great-great-great-grandchildren to be colored, they're thinking at one level, but they're not thinking simultaneously at the conscious level that black people will cause white genetic annihilation. But for these painters, it comes out with the power of black all over a canvas.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? The dominant thing that you see is the black strokes or the black splattering.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the fear of white genetic annihilation being expressed. But of course, it's being called something else.
Right. So it's also...
If Motherwell links his paintings to Spain,
mm-hmm.
and what happened in Spain, the history of Spain is that Africans conquered Spain. The Moors were in Spain for 700 years.
Mm-hmm.
And when they left, the Spaniards were darker people
mm-hmm.
because of the genetic influence. And then after the Moors were chased back into Africa, then the ritual of killing the black bull.
Right.
Do you see? The bull being, although the Spaniards don't say this, but my interpretation is that the bull is a symbol of the black male, and the whole ritual is about killing the bull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's also interesting. I came across something that he mentions where he jokes, he says, why is it that I have such an attraction, to this blackness, being a white Northern Protestant? He says, it's as though I had a Spanish grandfather, kind of making a joke of this possibility that, that there is this kind of...
See, but that's absolutely also, what you're reading is truly fascinating,
mm-hmm.
because white people did come from the black people in Africa.
Right.
As mutations to albinism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? You
right.
see it played out in Darth Vader in Star Wars. Do you see where Luke Skywalker, the blonde white, and the father is Darth Vader, and that's like the German, Vater for father, and dark, and someone dressed all in black.
Maybe we could read these sort of gestures of painting onto the painting in black, onto the white canvas as kind of a way of projecting these fears of death in black onto, projecting it outside of oneself.
Well, I think I would read, do you see, in other words, Motherwell or Pollock is it's a white person using black paint.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are the person who is identifying with being able to use the black paint. It's like the white male's subconscious desire to have the power that he really sees in the black male.
Uh-huh.
Do you see? It's like white men putting on black leather. It's like what we are seeing now in the number of white men that are covering their bodies with tattoos.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of
a... It's like, well, maybe because people decided if I keep tanning, I'll get skin cancer. And so tanning, I won't say at all that tanning has stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? But following tanning, we now have, full body tattooing or extensive areas of the body being covered in color.
Mm-hmm.
In a system of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? But I say that the white supremacy itself is a projection. It's only, if I feel inadequate, then I want to project that I'm superior to.
Uh-huh. So it's both a way of controlling it and also identifying with it, or is it more just this idea of having mastery over?
I would say identifying with it. In other words, when a white male wants to be dressed up and appear most elegant,
mm-hmm.
he doesn't put on a white suit, he puts on a black suit.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you
I mean, yeah, but black also happens to be the kind of the official color of the art world in terms of what people wear at openings and stuff like that when they want to...
Well, that's it. It's like everybody wants to have, white women, everybody has to have a basic black dress.
Right.
Do you see, at the same time that at the surface level, black is degraded, but at the subconscious level, there is the desire to be black, to be dressed in black, to appear elegant, to appear powerful, which
mm-hmm.
is what black represents. In other words, if a white male wants to appear most powerful in terms of smoking objects, he doesn't smoke a cigarette, he smokes a cigar.
Uh-huh.
Or a pipe,
uh-huh.
as opposed to a cigarette.
Uh-huh.
Do you see? And like the cigarette is referred to as a faggot, as, it's fags.
Right.
So at the subconscious level, there is the awareness of the power of black, and most fundamentally, the genetic power of black. But it is denied at the conscious level with the structuring of a system of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens in the art world, do you see, it ends up coming out, I would say, at the subconscious. It's like dream material.
Uh-huh.
Do you see, what comes out in the dream is very often different packages of the dream is symbolic speech. It's not what the person is thinking about consciously, it is what is going on at the subconscious level.
So then you think also maybe the part of the appeal of why Motherwell's work is so popular, why so many people want to have these images in their house, which are in some ways kind of these, quite, he describes it as sort of tragic and violent and, kind of depressing things, would be because of these unconscious associations that people then want to own and kind of feel like they have some control over it, as well as identify with?
I would say mostly identification with.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You see, it's identification, but not at a conscious level.
Mm-hmm.
It's like white people telling black people they're ugly, but white people wanting to have a tan. Do you see? It's like whether the question that is raised within the context of white culture, who has the biggest penis, the white male or the black male? The majority of white people would say the black male.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? And so whether is that desired, I would say yes.
And when I was going through, some of Motherwell's statements, I came across this where he says, "If painting is partly war, then one of my chief weapons is a sense of the blackness of black. And in certain desperate situations, it's the gun I pull out." And I thought it was interesting that he says the blackness of black, which kind of really makes any other connections to black kind of invisible. But then he calls it a weapon or a kind of gun that he can use when he feels kind of self-doubt, or anxiety. So I was wondering if you could kind of make that clear, this how the idea of black weapon kind of fits into the larger context of white racism and violence towards people of color.
See, I would read that. First of all, he's putting it in the context of war.
Mm-hmm.
And racism, white supremacy is war against black people in general and black men in particular. And he goes on to talk about the blackness of black. I would say that he's saying the power of black, the very genetic power of black.
Mm-hmm.
And in certain desperate situations, it's a gun I pull out. So he's seeing black as power, but at the same time, he's identifying with it. And since he owns the paints, he uses the paints, and so the paint can is my symbolic weapon. But what am I doing? I'm identifying with what the black man is able to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling that this is the enemy. This is a threat. It's like I say, all the discussion about terrorism that goes on, when people who classify themselves as white basically are controlling power in the world today. But the threat that they project is people of color, Afghanistan people in Iraq, and in the Middle East. Do you see? These people are being called the terrorists, but who's the superpower?
Right.
And who has the biggest weapon?
Mm-hmm.
Who has the most nuclear weapons? Who has the weapons of mass destruction? But the projection is that men who are non-white are the threat.
So with somebody like Motherwell, who kind of considered himself a humanist and was very critical of fascism and the kind of U.S., it seemed like on one level he was trying to make work, on a conscious level he was making work that kind of addressed the kind of cruelty of war and injustice. But then on this unconscious level, he's creating these symbols of violence, and projecting hatred and this kind of association of black as a kind of negative quality that really perpetuates this much larger sort of global injustice of white racism. So I was wondering, what kind of approaches would you kind of suggest to white people who are trying to break this unconscious activity and trying to find a new language that can that doesn't fall into the same kind of symbolic sort of trappings of white racism in terms of how to kind of go about doing that? Does it require that one kind of renounces being a part of the white race, or what would you suggest?
Well, I would say there has to, it's the same thing that I said, the challenge for white behavioral scientists helping people who classify themselves as white face the reality. We are a tiny minority on the planet, and we are genetic recessive to the vast majority of people on the planet Earth, and we have built a system, a total system, construct to prevent our genetic annihilation. So, do you see, helping people come to terms with that reality? Like in my training as a psychiatrist, we were taught the role of the psychiatrist is to help people face reality even when they are afraid to do so. Mm-hmm. Do you see? But even the white people who talk about whiteness, mm-hmm. do you see, they will not deal with what the black people have theorized and talked about, what racism, white supremacy is. Do you see? The very same racism prevents them from dealing with what the black people have analyzed. Mm-hmm. And they go off in a tangent and using, zillions of words to talk about white privilege and whiteness. But they will not talk about system of racism, white supremacy, and what is driving that in their own psyche.
Mm-hmm. But as I kind of understand it, or in what I've read, it seems like the whole interrogation of whiteness comes from, originally from sort of black thinkers like Du Bois, and others, James Baldwin, who really kind of were the people that, that were first to kind of make these observations and claims about sort of what white privilege constituted.
Do you see, but nobody has said other than myself that it's tied to white genetic vulnerability.
Uh-huh.
Do you see, in the fear of white genetic annihilation? And that fear of genetic annihilation is what drives white people to wage war against non-white people all over the planet. And until they face that fear of genetic annihilation, in other words, why white privilege? White privilege is necessary in order to prevent white genetic annihilation. Do you see? But they're not dealing with that.
Right.
And as far as I know, they refuse to deal with it. And so, in other words, the problem is not going to be solved when one goes off dealing with, you could say white privilege is a symptom. The disease is the fear. The fundamental issue is the fear of white genetic annihilation on a planet where the overwhelming majority of people are non-white, you see, but you can't simultaneously talk about white genetic recessiveness and hold in your mind white genetic superiority.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why that is not dealt with.
Right. What I find kind of really concerning about Motherwell's work is that those forms, to you and to myself are quite identifiable as
mm-hmm.
Sort of phallic symbols.
Mm-hmm.
But in sort of this, he made something like 300 versions of this painting,
mm-hmm.
and the forms kind of tended to really kind of become more or less sort of abstract. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if perhaps we could kind of think about that as kind of paralleling a process in the broader society where sort of racist ideas have become sort of more subtle. It's sort of in culture and law and social practices, the white supremacism is clearly running things, but it's even more suppressed in terms of sort of day-to-day conversations, particularly when white people like to think of themselves as kind of being colorblind and living in a colorblind society.
See, but even that, there are various ways of looking at the terminology colorblind. See, I could be blind to the interest of colored people. I remember talking to a white male. He was in the government, involved with black-white relations. And so he was talking about color blindness, and I said to him, let me see what color socks you have on. Do you see, if you're going to be color blind, I notice that you have 2 black socks on. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be blind to color, then you might walk out of the house with 1 white sock on or 1 red sock.
Yeah.
Do you see? So why, why does anyone have to be blind to reality?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what's wrong with looking at reality for what it is, which is the only way that, certainly problems can be solved, is dealing with them for what it is.
Uh-huh.
And coming to terms with what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Not I have to, fantasize and pretend that it's not here. And so then I can keep on doing what I'm doing, So I say the fundamental thing that, people who classify themselves as white and who want to contribute to the issue of justice on the planet, because you can't have white supremacy and justice at the same time. I mean, my whole purpose is replace racism, white supremacy with justice on this planet. But unless white supremacy is confronted, then, we will just have, as President Bush talks about, continuous war.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't talk about continuous war in the terms that I'm talking about, but he talks about the terrorists and what the terrorists are doing to us and the threat that the terrorists pose to us, and all of the terrorists are non-white people and non-white men in particular. Do you see? And so white people find themselves in these prisons attacking the genitals of colored men in the prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would not be done to German prisoners or French prisoners. Do you see? But they find themselves attacking men of color and attacking their genitals.
Perhaps I misphrased my statement, or maybe I could pose the question in a different way, which is that, do you think that while on a surface level we're kind of ignoring or not wanting to talk about race, or like to think that we've moved past it, that the symbolic activities and the activities that express more of an unconscious drive have become more overt or more extreme in terms of white racist behavior?
See, if we think about racism, white supremacy as a global system, and whatever people say about the Holocaust of Semites in the Second World War, because Hitler said they were not white,
mm-hmm.
and that's why he was going to kill them. This is in Mein Kampf. But look at the tens of millions of black people that are being killed on the continent of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, with a man-made biological warfare weapon? Do you see? So mass murder is going on. And as long as this issue, in other words, what's in the depth of the white psyche? What's in the psyche of people who classify themselves as white? Do you see, like you yourself, you say, I'm half Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, meaning that I am half Semitic? Do you see what I'm saying? Hitler didn't go after the Jews. He said, I'm not interested in their religion. The religion has nothing to do with it. They are not white.
Right.
Because of the area of the world that they come from. I am white. And wanting to hold on to that,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to being non-white in a system of white supremacy.
Yeah.
Do you see? So that the non-white, has to be degraded, destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the white collective, in my view, have to be helped to come to terms with. But, who's going to, certainly a non-white person cannot make them.
Right.
A non-white person can talk about it, and then they can dismiss it. Like someone told me that they were talking to some book reviewers, said, well, why hasn't the ISIS papers been reviewed? Well, we're just dismissing it.
I think what also is sort of groundbreaking or has changed my perspective or has kind of confirmed something that I have kind of suspected is that you really frame racism or this fear of genetic annihilation as the kind of central guiding principle of the way the world is kind of organized. You know, Marxists tend to put economics first, or, you know, some people like to say, oh, well, it's, you know, it's economics and it's gender and it's race, or it's a tendency towards kind of war, or liking to think of things in terms of binaries of good and evil, or, you know, whatever. But I think that's a really sort of powerful concept of thinking that really racism is sort of at the core of all those categories of life activity.
Right. In other words, what is done is in entertainment, what is done in politics, what is done in economics or education is a part of the system of racism, white supremacy. You see, that's the, you know, sort of like the power of the sun is what is keeping the planets in motion.
Well, that's a good place to end. So thank you so much for doing this.
And I commend you for, you know, looking at this issue, because if, you know, people who classify themselves as white, if they're in dialogue with other people who classify themselves as white, any kind of breakthrough in terms of this is what we need to look at, I think it's important.
Yeah, well, yeah,
you see, it's not people who classify themselves as white saying they understand or they want to help black people, or Madonna, we're going to adopt a black child, please. You see, that's not the answer. White people need to be dialoguing with other white people about what they are actually, you know, really who they are on the planet. They're a tiny minority of people.
Yeah. And
the only way that they can stay in power is if they are killing as many non-white people as they can, but calling it something else. You see, but if there are people who classify themselves as white, you know, who are saying, look, we need to look at this.
Right.
And not pretend. I consider all the discussion about whiteness theory is a pretense that they are dealing with the problem.
Yeah. The way I had been working before was, you know, I was just kind of sitting in my studio and reading as much as I could. You know.
Do you paint, or what do you do?
Yeah, I'm a painter. And as I was growing up in New York, I was kind of always amazed by black athletes and particularly into sort of black music and hip hop. And I always thought, well, why is it that on one level I, you know, really kind of love this culture and this music, but I kind of take it in, and yet I keep a kind of distance from, you know, engaging with people of color, and so I kind of really tried to look at the kind of history of white artists that look to black culture for ideas and take it, you know, as for their own, and then, you know, use it, but without really kind of arguing for sort of a broader change in the way this relationship is set up. And so it just at some point I felt like there was only so much I could learn from reading about whiteness or reading about racism, and that really the next step was beginning to kind of dialogue with people and let that become kind of part of my work. So I continue to paint, and a lot of the paintings I do kind of, you know, I try to address this kind of combination of desire and fear around people of color that, although I'm not proud of it, that I have, and then at the same time try to continue to talk to people who are thinking seriously about racism as an ongoing and major source of injustice in the world, and to develop a kind of archive of those conversations, which this will then be a part of.
Well, good luck to you, and as I said, I give you credit certainly for, willingness to try to look at, because it's a deadly process. Do you see? It's the same thing that allowed the Semites of the Jewish religion to be destroyed, if they would only look at that. Do you see? Because I say that, Jewish people are being, because of this desire to be accepted as white, and black people have a variation on that in terms of, if white is dominant, then I want to be accepted as white. Or I don't want to displease white. Do you see? But I say that the same powers that allowed Jewish people to be destroyed in Europe, do you see, say, well, we'll put you over in the Middle East, and you want to be white, we'll let you be a white surrogate state. Now you kill the other Semites for us. In the process, be killed yourself. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I had never put that together.
Do you see? But they're not looking at. I mean, my graduation present from college was my parents said, "What do you want?" I said, "Send me to Germany." That's 1957. I want to go and live with German people and ask them in person, did they understand what they were doing to their neighbors? And everybody that I asked, they'd always look down at their feet, meaning they were, on the surface, nice people. But they allowed people that they did not consider to be white to be destroyed.
So the way that this, that the installation that I've done is organized is there are two large rooms, and the walls have been painted with these copies of the Elegies, many of the Elegies, and then they go back and forth between the straight presentation of these black forms on the white ground with, and I inverted them so that they're white forms against the black ground to kind of expose these forms as symbols of sort of white male supremacy. And then the audio, this is included, as well as some of my own kind of reflections on race, and then kind of goes in that to kind of recontextualize these images in relation into racism.
See, I mean, I appreciate, in other words, if you start with the premise, I want to survive as white. If I'm putting a value on white, which is a genetic recessive state, then I have to destroy as many non-white people as I can. Somehow destroy them or put them into a state of dysfunction. Do you see? In other words, if everybody did what Martin Luther King suggested, everybody should love, and that love was manifested in terms of sexual intercourse, then white would disappear on the planet.
Yeah.
Do you see? So it really is a dilemma for white people. I mean, in other words, if let's say that if the power tables were turned, and so the people of color on the planet, the planetary majority, were in charge tomorrow morning, and they said to white people, well, if you want to survive, we will arrange that. No non-white people will have sexual relations with people who are classifying themselves as white. No problem. Do you see? But you will not dominate the planet. Because...
because of the numbers.
Majority, anytime you have a majority dominating a minority, I mean a majority being dominated by a minority, do you see, there has to be injustice and mistreatment.
I find myself in an odd position because, on the one hand, like I mentioned to you, I'm part Jewish. I also, on a conscious level, don't feel any sort of desire to preserve, the white race, or, I think that, in some ways that idea seems very kind of unfamiliar to me because it seems kind of like absurd, what's the big deal about, skin color? And if it were up to me, I wouldn't, personally, I wouldn't mind if my child was of a darker skin color than myself. But yet I continue to, if you were to ask me if I was, white or a person of color, I would say, I'm white, and that's how I feel that I'm perceived by the kind of society around me. So I guess what I'm saying is I definitely understand how I continue to reap the benefits of being seen as white and thinking of myself as white, but I have trouble making that connection to seeing my kind of activities as being tied to this effort to preserve the white race.
Well, it's because that's not a thought that you are operating with at the conscious level. Mm-hmm. And nor, you might say that for 100% of the other people who classify themselves as white that you relate to. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Which is why the activity can be so destructive because, we're not going to look at that.
Right.
We're not going to think about that. Mm-hmm. Do you see? And then in the meantime, we are going to, a certain percentage of us will call ourselves liberal, mm-hmm. well-intentioned. Do you see? And mm-hmm. the others who don't, sort of like a good cop, bad cop. Mm-hmm. Or like I see the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Those are the two wings of the white supremacy party, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Neither group is interested in undoing the system of racism and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Because everybody is invested in white genetic survival. Do you see? So when the artists don't, no, this doesn't have anything to do mm-hmm. with racism. Mm-hmm. Do you see? That denial is essential to the maintenance of the system itself. And you said Motherwell has how many?
It's funny because I was talking to their foundation, and I said, I'm really interested in his work, and I was wondering if I could come by and see, what the work is, what you guys have in your archives. Mm. And they were, very proud, and they said, we have, they have over 300. I guess he retitled a lot or destroyed some and made new ones of the same number, mm-hmm. but they know of 300 that he made. And
variations on.
Yeah, and they said, what's the research you're doing? And I said, well, I'm looking into the kind of latent sort of racial symbolism of Motherwell's work. And after that, I got a very polite email saying that I wouldn't be able to come in and look at their work, at the images. So I should have been a little bit more tactful, but I was kind of naive, I suppose, and thought that they'd be interested in that because people don't really pay much attention to his work anymore. He's kind of thought of as sort of outdated or, mm-hmm. not very relevant work. Although if they thought about it in the context of racism, maybe they would find the work very kind of, people might think of it as being quite sort of relevant to the current state of things.
I would be surprised if, people might say, oh, wow, yes, but I think that, the tendency at this point in time would be the kind of brush off that you got when you mentioned it, mm-hmm. To the foundation. Mm-hmm. We don't want to take any interpretation in that direction.
Right. Well,
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
All right.
Take care.
Bye now.